I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've done, and kind of what I was asked to do was thinking about data group and data work embedded in policy, so that kind of position where data meets policy. And the sort of image that I had in my head was, this is quite a messy place. There's a lot of different kind of pressures, and some of it's political, and some of it's public, and some of it is technical, and stakeholders, and so on. And it kind of felt like the intertidal zone, this place where the sea meets the beach or the land, the intertidal zone, is just a kind of a nice image, because what you've got is you've got rhythms. So you've got tides, and you've got to adapt to those. So there's something around the way that policy works and the tidal, and I'll kind of give up some examples in a moment. But the way that the policy speed operates is super important. And the second thing is you've got kind of space for diversity. And you've got space to try things, so little rock pools and things, and occasionally they merge together and occasionally they separate out again. And again, that sort of space is really important for experimenting. There's a lot at the moment around test and learn, and we'll see kind of some of that, I suspect, over the day. But that idea of experimenting definitely kind of comes into it. And then the third one is there's the tide flow and the surge. When something's happening and the public and politicians are interested, jump on board, use that. Use that for kind of driving some of the stuff that you want to do. So use the tide, and any of you are sailors, you'll know exactly how important that is in places like the Solent. So that was my metaphor. I'm going to stretch it, I suspect, and break it, but let's see. Three things that I'm going to talk about, and those sort of metaphor bits linked to them all. And the first is the work that we do around supporting ministers, so things like tracking priorities, informing decisions kind of as they happen. Second, around system change. I'm going to give a couple of examples about how you can improve the whole system of government through data work. And there are lots of ways of doing this, but the couple that I'll give in terms of practical and our outputs and how we work to policy to drive those into wider decisions. And then the third thing around supporting key sectors, so working with local government, working with planning, industry sectors and so on. And there's people in the room who know a huge amount about this, who can come and kind of pick brains and give more detail behind any of these. And before I jump into those, just to say the kind of data unit is embedded very much in the heart of the department. So we don't sit in digital or corporate. We sit right under the Deputy Prime Minister in the Strategy and Comms group. Occasionally the Strategy and Comms Director General says, why have I got a digital and data team in my group? And then we kind of work with them and says, okay, this is really useful. So that idea of being embedded in the centre and at the heart of it is a really interesting kind of, I think, challenge in terms of how you work on technical work. But we are primarily a data and digital technical group with data scientists, data engineers, people who build stuff. We work with lots of partners, including TPX and others, on delivering pieces of work direct into the system. So let's talk about the kind of first examples. So this was around supporting ministerial work and decisions as they happen. And I'm not going to talk through lots of data and say, and this meant that this was happening and so on. It's not that kind of talk, but I love doing that. So if anyone wants to kind of come and talk about what does this data actually mean, that's my happy place. So the key bits here are policy decisions, and ministers are going to make decisions. They're going to happen whether you're in the room or not. They're going to happen whether your stuff is informing them or not. They're not going to wait for a thing to be developed or go live. So the kind of idea of delivery and so on has that as a really hard constraint. And so if we're thinking, for example, about spending review, central government, Treasury, ministers, number 10 and others are going to make very big decisions on how the whole of government spend is happening. And anything you can do to kind of feed into that. And it's not just kind of landing a nice graph or a nice bit of output. It's about kind of really helping drive the decisions as they emerge can help. So being embedded in a policy area means that you kind of operate those rhythms, and that's the tidal bit. So what we started when we set up, we were really looking at how do we pull on data that's open or held by departments and rest of government. How do we put that into ways that ministers can get their heads round and then use for decisions? So we spent a lot of time thinking about data viz. We spent a lot of time thinking about tools. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about and anticipating the sorts of questions that ministers or advisors, so SPADs, or other senior officials are likely to come up with before you kind of get into the room. So things like, how does it play out in place? What's that, what's this kind of headline priority mean in local areas? All ministers are MPs, unless they're lords or ladies. So they really have a kind of strong link to place. And that's kind of where their head goes a lot of the time. So things like interactive mapping and tools like that, kind of getting on top of the digital delivery bit is really useful and really important. But being able to sort of deploy it very quickly. So things, for example, talking about the community disorder that happened following Southport events last summer. There were obviously riots, disorder in kind of a number of areas. Some of the questions that people ask, well, what are the sort of drivers that we know about over and above the immediate? Are these happening in particular areas? Are there differences in those areas? So again, being able to feed back and get into those discussions and look at deprivation levels, look at changing demographics and dynamics, looking at all of that for those particular areas and comparing against maybe a sample of similar types of areas to say, well, what didn't happen? Things like that are really important information to put into those ministerial decisions. Being able to tell data stories, so whether that's tools or be able to sit down and just talk people through that, again, critical info. We kind of know this, but when you're in the technical weeds of delivery, it's easy to just kind of focus in on I've got to build this thing. And, all of us, there's a temptation we must push past that. You aren't building a thing. You're informing decisions that this thing is going to help support. And so that's the kind of critical bit. And then the final one is coming back to this timescale bit. I mentioned SR, so the spending review. We set out with a frankly ludicrous timescale to look at what are the best models that we have for infrastructure around the country if we're going to build 1.5 million homes, if we're going to support industrial strategy clusters in different areas. What does that mean for water availability, energy, electricity, renewables, and demand, and so on? How's that likely to play out in the future? The only way we could do that was by getting real policy support to help us break through what was really a sort of technically very difficult problem, to come up with some way of modelling and then visualising that for ministers in SR kind of time, so in weeks, working across kind of multiple departments. So really hard stuff that really kind of feeds into those discussions in real time. So that was kind of first area, first lesson. The second bit I want to talk about is raising the bar. So something about how do you work to improve what government does. And my kind of model here was tidal pools. There's lots of stuff going on. How do you work with policy to help scale those? So when the tide comes in, when you've got an opportunity to really scale your work, how do you take that? And the example here I'm going to use is something called local spend. So when we first set up the data units, we were asked by the Minister or the Secretary of State to look at the question of what is the spatial footprint of government. Basically, where do we spend our cash? And there are lots of things that say, lots of research that says, ignore what people say, look at priorities based on how they have prioritised resources, and often that's cash. So looking at how government spends cash it's the sum total of every decision made on every programme across every department. That's a kind of big deal. So if you can get that data and work that data out, you've then got a kind of a really important input into discussions about, in the olden days, levelling up, in the current days, rebalancing the economy, investing to kind of drive local growth in areas outside the Great South East, for example. So we started off this local spend work, sub-national expenditure, working on kind of, this is in our pool, working on data and finance systems, doing good, solid work around standards and around tagging and geocoding, some nice kind of fuzzy matching of organisations to areas, thinking about that kind of HQ effects and so on. And we got to a point where effectively we thought, actually, we've got a pretty good answer for our department. We're going to publish this as experimental stats, and that in itself was quite a big step. And we pushed that through, and kind of that went very well. Alongside that, we worked with Treasury and other departments to try doing the same. And then eventually, we kind of were able to push this into SR discussions into Treasury discussions. If you are a department thinking about a proposal to spend 5 to 10 billion quid in spending review, you now have to think about how that's going to land at local level through this work, which has kind of scaled up and raised the bar for the way that government thinks about its current investment, its current programs, and so on. So kind of small rock pool work, which you help and work with policy areas and policy colleagues, can really help you scale to something pretty sizable. There's another example which some of the people in the room will have worked on. This is the funding service. This is a piece of work that started in MHCLG and is an MHCLG digital program. It's not the data unit, so some of the work that I'm talking about here is not led by the data unit, but it is doing some brilliant stuff on how do you simplify the process of just giving grants, which the department does about 22 billion quid a year, giving grants to local areas. This is a product and a service that streamlines that. But once you get policy colleagues involved, once they kind of realise the point and the saving, you then get local government colleagues saying, well, why aren't other departments using exactly this? Why are they running their own systems, building stuff? So it's that scaling up effect and that kind of branching out, raising the bar, that data and policy will need you, that working together is critical. I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not really going to talk about AI in the department. We're doing stuff that you would probably expect, looking at co-pilots, looking at various other things. What I will just talk about, and finally, is the work around using the tidal surge that is the interest in AI. An interest in AI basically translates to get your data right, make sure you've got the digital products that can use it, and then if there's a way of doing some kind of intelligent thinking about that and use of that on top, that's AI. The old sort of thing, AI was when we talked to possible funders. It's data science when you're recruiting, it's logistic regression when you're doing. All of those things still hold, but there's some great work going on under the sort of AI banner. So just quickly, kind of how do you use that? There's a great piece of work from the local digital team in the department, which has been going for a few years now, on strengthening cyber resilience in local governments, working on standards in local governments. What we're working with them at the moment is to scale that up to include, and now we've added AI, to support local government. There are some brilliant digital, like industry solutions providers out there doing some really good stuff to save money and time for local government. We want to think and work on how does government help scale that. And in some ways, it might be about building stuff. I suspect in other ways, it'll be more about supporting industry and others to build stuff. But there's definitely a scale thing there, and kind of building on the AI opportunities paper and the digital state of government papers released last month. And the final example from that, which again, people in the room working on this, and I think we'll hear about later in the day, digital planning, it's this using the centre as a way of supporting industry sectors, supporting local planning authorities and local authority work around planning, and about improving the data for public citizens, but for decision makers by planners and for others. The centre has a great role on that, and there's definitely some great AI work and digital work here, which again, through SR, will be scaling up a little bit more. So, and someone like Paul at the back there can happily tell you much more on this, but there are others talking about it in the day as well. So I'm going to pause there and open up for questions if we've got any time. 3 things from the Intertidal zone. That was it. It is a messy place, but there's lots of good stuff. Thank you.
Wonderful.